We are providing you free audiobook summaries to add value in your life and save your valuable time of precious life. Before we start, make sure to subscribe to our channel to get long book summaries for free to get complete information from the book instead of wasting your time. The Psychology of Money by Morgan Housel. Introduction: The Greatest Show on Earth. The introduction to The Psychology of Money establishes the fundamental premise that financial success is not necessarily about what you know, but rather about how you behave. Morgan Housel opens this section by contrasting two real-life individuals who represent the extremes of financial outcomes. The first is Ronald Read, a man who worked as a janitor and a gas station attendant for his entire life. He lived a quiet and unassuming existence in a small house, but when he died at the age of 92, he left behind an estate worth over $8 million. He had accomplished this not through a high salary or a lucky inheritance, but by simply saving small amounts of money and investing them in blue-chip stocks over many decades. His story is one of patience and the long-term power of compounding. In stark contrast, Housel describes the life of Richard Fuscone, a Harvard-educated executive at Merrill Lynch, who was highly successful in the world of high finance. Fuscone was the embodiment of professional knowledge and sophistication, yet he took on massive amounts of debt and made highly leveraged bets on luxury real estate. When the financial crisis hit in 2008, his wealth evaporated and he was forced into bankruptcy. The juxtaposition of these two men serves as a powerful illustration that a janitor with no formal financial education can outperform a high-level executive if the janitor possesses the right behavioral traits. Housel argues that we typically think of finance as a math-based field similar to physics, where there are hard rules and formulas that govern outcomes. However, he suggests that money is actually governed by psychology, which is a soft skill. In physics, an electron behaves the same way every time it is placed in a specific environment. But in finance, human emotions like greed, fear, and social pressure cause people to act in ways that defy logical models. Most of the financial problems people face today are not caused by a lack of access to information or a misunderstanding of interest rates, but by an inability to control their impulses. The author explains that the modern financial world is relatively new. Most of the tools we use today, such as individual retirement accounts or index funds, have only existed for a few decades. This means that as a species, we are still novices when it comes to managing wealth in the modern era. We are trying to navigate a complex system using biological hardware that was designed for survival in the wild, not for managing a diversified portfolio. This mismatch between our ancient instincts and our modern environment is why so many intelligent people make disastrous financial decisions. The greatest show on earth, as Housel calls it, is the theater of human behavior as it relates to money. He notes that studying people's interactions with money is one of the best ways to understand human nature in general. Money is one of the few things that touches almost every aspect of our lives, from our relationships and our sense of security to our status in society. By observing how people earn, spend, and lose money, we can see the full spectrum of human psychology on display. This book is not meant to be a technical guide on how to pick stocks or time the market, but rather a collection of stories and observations that help us understand the invisible forces that drive our financial lives. Housel concludes the introduction by stating that his goal is to convince the reader that doing well with money has little to do with how smart you are and a lot to do with how you behave. He invites us to look past the spreadsheets and the data and to focus instead on the human element of finance. Understanding our own biases and motivations is the first step toward building a secure and prosperous future. The chapters that follow explore 19 specific quirks and flaws in human psychology that influence our relationship with money, starting with the idea that no one is actually crazy when it comes to their financial choices. Chapter 1: No One's Crazy. In the first chapter, Housel addresses the common tendency to judge others for their financial decisions by explaining that while people do some crazy things with money, no one is actually crazy. He argues that every person makes decisions based on their own unique experiences and the specific world they were born into. Your personal history with money makes up perhaps 1/100th of a millionth of what has happened in the world, but it represents about 80% of how you think the world works. A person who grew up during the Great Depression sees the world through a completely different lens than someone who grew up during the tech boom of the late 90s. One person sees risk as a terrifying threat to survival, while the other sees it as a necessary vehicle for growth. The author provides data to show that our willingness to take risks is heavily influenced by the state of the economy during our young adult years. If you were coming of age when the stock market was performing exceptionally well, you are likely to have a much more optimistic view of investing for the rest of your life. Conversely, if you entered the workforce during a period of high inflation or a stagnant market, you might remain skeptical of stocks even when the data suggests they are a great long-term investment. These people are not being illogical or ignoring the math. Rather, they are responding to the emotional reality of what they have lived through. It is one thing to read about a market crash in a history book and quite another to feel the genuine fear of losing your life savings in real time. Housel uses the example of lottery tickets to illustrate this point further. In the United States, the lowest income households spend a significantly higher percentage of their income on lottery tickets than the wealthiest households. To a middle-class observer, this looks like irrational behavior because the mathematical odds of winning are nearly zero. However, if you live in poverty and feel that a high-paying job or a large inheritance is entirely out of reach, the lottery ticket represents the only tangible path to a dream life. It is a few dollars spent on the ability to hope for a future that otherwise feels impossible. While it may be a poor financial move, it is a socially and emotionally understandable choice given their circumstances. The chapter emphasizes that we all have a different internal narrative about how money works. We are all trying to solve a different problem based on the hand we were dealt and the environment we inhabit. When you see someone making a financial choice that seems nonsensical, it is usually because they are playing a different game than you are. Their goals, their time horizons, and their fears are not yours. Modern financial science often tries to treat us like spreadsheet cells, but we are actually emotional beings who are just trying to make sense of a complex world. Housel concludes by reminding us that the financial world we live in today is still very new. Most of what we consider standard practice in personal finance has only been around for a single generation. We are still in the early stages of learning how to manage wealth, and we are doing it with brains that are wired for a much simpler time. This means we should have more empathy for ourselves and for others when mistakes are made. No one is truly crazy, because everyone is just doing the best they can with the information and the experiences they have. Chapter 2, Luck and Risk. In the second chapter, Housel explores the inseparable and often overlooked relationship between luck and risk. He starts by explaining that both are driven by the same reality, which is that the world is too complex for your actions to dictate 100% of your outcomes. Every outcome in life is the result of a combination of individual effort and forces outside of your control. We tend to celebrate success as a product of pure hard work and dismiss failure as a product of poor decision-making. But in reality, luck and risk are two sides of the same coin. They both represent the idea that you are just one person in a world with billions of moving parts, and sometimes those parts move in your favor or against you. The author uses the story of Bill Gates to anchor this concept. Gates attended Lakeside School in Seattle, which was one of the only high schools in the world that had a computer in the late 1960s. The odds of a high school student having access to a computer at that time were roughly 1 in a million. Gates himself has acknowledged that if there had been no Lakeside, there would be no Microsoft. This was an incredible stroke of luck. However, Housel also tells the story of Kent Evans, who was Gates's best friend and a fellow computer prodigy at the same school. Evans had the same talent and the same ambition as Gates, but he died in a mountain climbing accident before he graduated from high school. The odds of a high schooler dying in a mountain climbing accident are also roughly 1 in a million. Evans experienced the extreme version of risk, while Gates experienced the extreme version of luck. The difficulty with luck and risk is that neither can be measured or quantified easily. When we see someone succeed, we often ignore the hidden role that luck played because it is more comfortable to believe that the world is a meritocracy where effort always equals reward. Similarly, when we see someone fail, we often assume they were lazy or reckless, ignoring the possibility that they took a calculated risk that simply didn't work out due to bad luck. This creates a dangerous environment where we try to emulate the specific actions of billionaires without realizing that their success might have been a unique result of a specific time and place that cannot be replicated. Housel suggests that because of the hidden influence of luck, we should be careful about who we admire and who we look down upon. Instead of studying extreme individual examples like Warren Buffett or Elon Musk, it is much more effective to look for broad patterns of success and failure. The more common a pattern is, the more likely it is to be applicable to your own life, and the less likely it is to be the result of an extreme outlier of luck. For example, the idea that people who have control over their time tend to be happier is a broad pattern that applies to almost everyone, regardless of their specific circumstances. The chapter also emphasizes the importance of humility in success and compassion in failure. When things are going well, you must realize that you are probably not as smart as you think you are, and that luck is likely playing a role in your favor. This realization helps you stay grounded and prepared for when the tide eventually turns. When things are going poorly, you must realize that you are probably not as incompetent as you feel, and that you may simply be on the wrong side of a risk. Keeping this perspective prevents you from becoming paralyzed by regret or overconfident during a winning streak. Housel concludes by stating that the best way to handle the presence of luck and risk is to build a financial life that is robust enough to survive the inevitable hits of bad luck. This means focusing on things you can control, like your savings rate and your ego, rather than trying to perfectly predict or time the market. If you accept that luck and risk are always present, you will be less likely to judge yourself or others harshly and more likely to focus on the long-term behaviors that lead to sustainable wealth. Chapter 3, Never Enough. In the third chapter, Housel explores the psychological danger of moving the goalposts of success and the catastrophic mistakes people make when they lose sight of the concept of enough. He begins by telling the stories of two incredibly wealthy men who had everything a person could dream of, yet risked it all for even more. The first is Rajat Gupta, who rose from being an orphan in India to becoming the CEO of McKinsey and a board member at Goldman Sachs. Despite having a net worth of around $100 million, he wanted to be a billionaire so badly that he engaged in insider trading and ended up in prison, destroying his reputation and his career. The second is Bernie Madoff, who had a legitimate and highly successful business, but chose to build a massive Ponzi scheme because the legitimate wealth he had earned was not enough to satisfy his ego. Housel argues that the hardest financial skill is getting the goalpost to stop moving. For many people, as their income increases, their expectations and desires increase right along with it. This creates a perpetual cycle of dissatisfaction because no matter how much you earn, you always feel like you are falling behind someone else. This is driven by social comparison, which is a battle that can never be won. There will always be someone who is richer, more successful, or more famous than you are. If you compare yourself to a billionaire when you are a millionaire, you will feel poor. The only way to win the game of social comparison is to refuse to play it in the first place and to accept that you have enough, even if it is less than the person next to you. The author emphasizes that enough does not mean living like a hermit or settling for less than you need. It means realizing that an insatiable appetite for more will eventually lead you to a point of regret. Many of the most important things in life, like reputation, freedom, family, and friends, are not worth risking for an extra bit of wealth that you do not actually need. When people lack a sense of enough, they begin to take risks with money they do need in hopes of making money they do not need. This is a mathematical and psychological error that often leads to total ruin. Housel provides a few reminders for those struggling with the urge for more. First, he notes that the ceiling of social comparison is so high that virtually no one will ever reach it, so trying to get there is a fool's errand. Second, he points out that there are many things that are never worth risking, regardless of the potential gain. These include your integrity, your peace of mind, and your independence. True wealth is the ability to walk away from a deal or a situation that compromises your values. If you are a slave to the pursuit of more, you are not truly wealthy, no matter how many zeros are in your bank account. The chapter highlights that happiness is basically just results minus expectations. If your expectations grow faster than your results, you will never be happy, regardless of how much money you make. By fixing your expectations and defining what enough looks like for you personally, you regain control over your life. You stop being a performer in someone else's show and start living a life that is actually satisfying to you. This is one of the most difficult skills to master because it requires fighting against the natural human instinct for more, but it is essential for long-term financial and emotional stability. Housel concludes by stating that enough is the realization that the opposite of more is not less but satisfaction. When you know you have enough, you are free from the anxiety of the hunt. You can invest with a long-term perspective because you are not desperate for an immediate score, and you can enjoy what you have without the constant fear of losing your status. Knowing when to stop taking risks that could harm your existing well-being is the ultimate sign of financial intelligence. Chapter 4. Confounding Compounding. In the fourth chapter, Housel explores the astronomical power of compounding and why the human brain struggles to grasp its exponential nature. He starts with a startling observation about Warren Buffett, noting that while everyone knows he is one of the wealthiest men in history, few realize that over 99% of his wealth was accumulated after his 50th birthday, and over 96% of it came after he turned 65. If Buffett had started investing in his 30s and retired in his 60s like a normal person, he would likely be a name you have never heard of. His secret was not necessarily being a better investor than everyone else, but being a good investor for an incredibly long time. He began investing seriously at age 10 and has continued for over 8 decades. Housel explains that compounding is counterintuitive because we tend to think in linear terms. If we add 8 plus 8 plus 8, we get 24, but if we multiply 8 by itself multiple times, the numbers explode into millions and billions. Our minds are not designed to process this kind of growth, which leads us to overlook the most important variable in investing, which is time. We often search for the highest possible returns or the next big stock tip because those things feel like they require action and intelligence. However, the real wealth is built by the silent and boring process of waiting. The most powerful force in finance is not a high return, but a consistent return held for a very long duration. The author uses the example of ice ages to further illustrate how small changes lead to massive results through compounding. Scientists discovered that ice ages are not necessarily caused by extremely cold winters, but by slightly cool summers. If a summer is cool enough that it does not melt the previous winter's snow, that snow remains on the ground. The following winter, more snow piles on top, and eventually, the weight and the reflective nature of the ice create a feedback loop that covers entire continents in glaciers. A tiny bit of leftover snow repeated every year for thousands of years changes the entire face of the planet. Investing works the same way, where the small amount of interest you earn today becomes the base for the interest you earn tomorrow. Housel points out that the greatest challenge to compounding is our own desire to interfere with it. Because the results of compounding are backloaded, meaning they only become truly spectacular at the very end of the process, many people give up during the early years when progress feels slow. They see their portfolio growing by small amounts and decide to change their strategy or chase a more exciting investment. This interrupts the compounding process and forces them to start over. To succeed, you do not need to be a genius or have an incredibly high IQ. You simply need to stay out of your own way and let time do the heavy lifting. The chapter emphasizes that good investing is not necessarily about making good decisions. It is about consistently not making bad ones. If you can avoid the major mistakes that force you to pull your money out of the market, you allow the math of compounding to work in your favor. Many of the most successful investors are simply the ones who survived the longest. They didn't necessarily have the highest annual returns, but they had returns that were good enough for a long enough period that the exponential curve eventually took over. The goal should be to create a system that is sustainable so that you never have to interrupt the compounding process unnecessarily. Housel concludes by stating that compounding is the closest thing to magic in the financial world. It is the only force that can take a modest amount of money and turn it into a fortune, without requiring superhuman effort or extreme risk. However, it requires a level of patience and long-term thinking that is rare in a world obsessed with immediate results. If you can master the psychology of waiting and understand that the real gains happen at the end of the curve, you will have a massive advantage over everyone else who is trying to get rich quickly. Chapter 5. Getting Wealthy versus Staying Wealthy. In the 5th chapter, Housel explores the vital distinction between the skills required to make money and the skills required to keep it. He argues that getting wealthy and staying wealthy are two entirely different disciplines. Getting wealthy requires taking risks, being optimistic, and putting yourself out there. It is an aggressive act that involves chasing opportunities and believing that the future will be better than the present. Staying wealthy, however, requires the exact opposite. It requires humility, a touch of paranoia, and the realization that what you have earned can be taken away just as quickly as it was gained. Staying wealthy is a defensive act that focuses on survival and the avoidance of ruin. The author uses the stories of Jesse Livermore and Abraham Germansky to illustrate this point. During the stock market crash of 1929, Livermore was one of the few people who made a fortune by shorting the market. He went home to his family as one of the richest men in the world, while most of Wall Street was in ruins. Meanwhile, Germansky, who was a successful real estate developer, lost everything in the crash and disappeared. However, only a few years later, Livermore himself lost his entire fortune and eventually took his own life. Both men were geniuses at getting wealthy, but they were both failures at staying wealthy because they didn't know how to stop taking extreme risks once they had already won the game. Housel suggests that the single most important word in money is survival. This does not mean just barely getting by, but rather making sure that your financial plan is robust enough to survive the inevitable periods of chaos and bad luck. If you can survive long enough for compounding to work its magic, you will eventually become wealthy. But if you take on too much risk and get wiped out during a market downturn, you are out of the game forever. The goal is to be financially unbreakable, so that you never have to sell your assets at the worst possible time. This requires a mindset of survival that balances optimism about the long term with a healthy fear of the short term. The chapter emphasizes the importance of a margin of safety, which is the gap between what you think will happen and what can happen, while still allowing you to be okay. In the world of engineering, a bridge is built to hold much more weight than it is expected to carry, just in case there is an unusual event. In finance, you should do the same by keeping more cash on hand than you think you need and by not assuming that the historical average returns of the stock market are guaranteed in the future. A margin of safety gives you the endurance to stay invested when everyone else is panicking, which is often when the best long-term gains are made. Housel also discusses the concept of a barbell personality. This means being an optimist about the future while being a paranoid about the things that could prevent you from reaching that future. You have to believe that the world will continue to grow and innovate over the next 20 years, but you also have to worry about what might happen in the next 20 days. This combination of long-term optimism and short-term paranoia is what allows you to stay in the game long enough to reap the rewards of growth. It is the ability to accept that the road will be rocky while remaining confident in the final destination. The chapter concludes by stating that the best way to stay wealthy is to remember that the world is unpredictable and that your past success is not a guarantee of future results. You must avoid the ego that comes with a big win and remain disciplined in your habits. Getting wealthy might make for a more exciting story, but staying wealthy is what actually creates a legacy. By prioritizing survival over performance, you ensure that you are around to enjoy the benefits of your hard work for the rest of your life. Chapter 6. Tails, You Win. In the 6th chapter, Housel explains the concept of tail events, which are the rare outlier occurrences that drive the majority of outcomes in finance and life. He starts by describing how art collecting works, noting that the most successful art dealers buy thousands of pieces of art and wait for a tiny fraction of them to become masterpieces. A dealer might be wrong on 99% of their purchases, but if they happen to own one painting by Picasso or Monet, that single success pays for all the other failures many times over. This is the essence of tail events, where a small number of events are responsible for the vast majority of the results. The author applies this logic to the stock market and business. He points out that most public companies are actually failures that eventually lose all their value or provide zero returns. If you look at the performance of the broad market indexes, like the S&P 500, you will find that a very small percentage of the companies such as Amazon or Apple are responsible for nearly all the gains. If you remove those few tail performers, the overall market return would be mediocre or even negative. This means that as an investor, you can be wrong most of the time, as long as you are right on a few big winners and you stay invested long enough to let those winners grow. Housel uses the career of Walt Disney to illustrate this in a corporate context. By the mid-1930s, Disney had produced hundreds of hours of film, but the company was deep in debt and facing bankruptcy. Then he released Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, which was an unprecedented success. That one single film changed everything for the company and provided the capital to build the Disney empire we know today. Everything else Disney had done up to that point was just a prelude to that one tail event. The same is true for venture capital firms, where the vast majority of their investments go to zero, but one or two hits like a Google or a Facebook make the entire fund a success. The chapter emphasizes that we often fail to appreciate tails because we expect the world to be more linear and predictable. When we see a successful investor, we assume they have a high hit rate and are right about every stock they buy. In reality, many of the best investors have a hit rate that is not much better than a coin flip. The difference is that when they are wrong, they lose a small amount, and when they are right, they win an enormous amount. Success is not about how often you are right, but about how much you make when you are right versus how much you lose when you are wrong. The psychological challenge of tail events is that they require you to be comfortable with a lot of failure and a lot of boredom. To catch a tail, you have to stay in the game and keep moving forward, even when most of your efforts seem to be leading nowhere. It is easy to feel like a failure when 9 out of 10 things you try don't work out. But if you understand the math of tails, you realize that this is just the price of admission for the one thing that will eventually change your life. You have to endure the many moments of being wrong to be there for the few moments of being spectacularly right. Housel concludes by stating that tails drive everything in our world, from the success of products to the movements of the stock market and even the course of human history. Once you accept that a few things will account for most of the results, you become much more patient and less stressed about the individual failures along the way. You learn to focus on the overall system rather than the individual parts. Being okay with a mess of failures punctuated by a few massive successes is the ultimate key to financial and emotional endurance. Chapter 7. Freedom. In the 7th chapter, Housel explores the idea that the highest form of wealth is the ability to wake up every morning and say, I can do whatever I want today. He argues that the true intrinsic value of money and the thing that provides the most happiness is not the ability to buy fancy things or live in a large house, but the ability to control your time. Having a sense of autonomy over your life is the strongest predictor of positive well-being, more so than your salary, the size of your home, or the prestige of your job. Money's greatest practical benefit is its ability to give you options and the freedom to make choices that align with your personal desires rather than being forced by financial necessity. Housel points out that although the standard of living has increased dramatically over the last several decades, our sense of control has actually diminished. In the past, Many jobs were manual or based on physical labor, which meant that when you left the factory or the farm, your work was finished for the day. In the modern knowledge economy, your work follows you everywhere on your phone and in your head. This means that even if we are earning more money, we often feel more stressed because we have lost the boundary between our work lives and our personal lives. We have traded our control for higher wages and more stuff, but the lack of control makes us feel like we are on a treadmill that we cannot get off of. The author explains that wealth is often what you do not see. It is the cars not purchased, the diamonds not bought, and the first-class tickets declined. Wealth is the money that has been saved and invested to buy you time in the future. Every bit of money you save is like a piece of your future that you have bought back from someone else. It allows you to wait for a better job opportunity rather than taking the first one that comes along because you need to pay the bills. It allows you to retire early or to take a lower-paying job that you find more meaningful. This flexibility is a massive competitive advantage in a world that is increasingly unpredictable. The chapter emphasizes that the feeling of being in the driver's seat of your own life is the most important ingredient for a happy life. People who feel they have no control over their schedule or their tasks tend to be miserable even if they are highly compensated. Conversely, people who have a modest income but complete control over how they spend their day tend to report much higher levels of life satisfaction. Money provides a safety net that allows you to walk away from a toxic boss or a soul-crushing environment. It is the ultimate insurance policy against the whims of others. Housel suggests that we should shift our perspective from using money to buy things to using money to buy time. When you realize that the most valuable thing you can own is your own time, your spending habits begin to change. You stop trying to impress people you do not like with money you do not have, and you start focused on building a reservoir of capital that protects your independence. The goal of financial planning should not be to reach a specific number for the sake of the number itself, but to reach a level of security that allows you to live life on your own terms. The chapter concludes by stating that freedom is the ultimate dividend of wealth. It is the peace of mind that comes from knowing you are not beholden to anyone else's schedule or demands. While the world often defines success by outward displays of consumption, the truly successful people are the ones who have used their money to secure their autonomy. By prioritizing freedom over status, you ensure that your money is actually working for you rather than you working for your money. Chapter 8. Man in the Car Paradox. In the 8th chapter, Housel introduces the man in the car paradox, which is a profound observation about how we perceive wealth and status. He begins by recalling his time as a valet at a high-end hotel in Los Angeles, where he saw many people drive up in spectacular luxury cars like Ferraris and Lamborghinis. He noticed a strange psychological phenomenon where he would look at the car and imagine himself in the driver's seat, thinking that if he owned such a vehicle, everyone would think he was cool and successful. However, the paradox is that he never actually looked at the driver of the car and thought that the person was cool. He was so focused on the object and how it would make him look that he completely ignored the person who actually owned it. This leads to a core insight about human nature, which is that we tend to use wealth as a signal to others that we should be liked and admired. We buy expensive clothes, fast cars, and large houses because we believe these things will act as a shortcut to gaining respect. But the reality is that other people do not use your possessions as a gauge of how much they respect you. Instead, they use your possessions as a benchmark for their own desires. When you drive a flashy car, you are providing a canvas for other people to paint their own fantasies upon. They are not admiring you, they are imagining themselves in your place. Housel argues that there is a massive disconnect between the reason people seek wealth and the way people react to wealth. Most people want to be wealthy because they want to be admired and respected by their peers. Yet the outward display of wealth is often the least effective way to gain genuine respect. It might garner envy or attention, but envy and respect are two very different things. True respect and admiration are earned through traits like humility, kindness, and empathy, rather than through the acquisition of expensive toys. If your goal is to be respected, you are far more likely to achieve it through your character than through your net worth. The author explains that this paradox is particularly dangerous because it leads to a cycle of wasted spending. People spend money they do not have to buy things they do not need to impress people they do not even like. This behavior drains the very capital that could have been used to buy freedom or security, as discussed in the previous chapter. By spending money on status symbols, you are effectively telling the world that you are wealthy while simultaneously making yourself less wealthy. You are trading your actual financial strength for a superficial image of success that most people are too self-absorbed to even notice. The chapter serves as a warning for those who feel the urge to keep up with the Joneses. Housel suggests that if you can internalize the man in the car paradox, you will save yourself an enormous amount of money and stress. You will realize that the social rewards of luxury goods are almost entirely an illusion created by your own mind. Once you stop trying to use money to buy admiration, you are free to use it for things that actually provide long-term value, such as peace of mind and the ability to control your own time. Housel concludes by reminding the reader that humility and modesty are much better tools for building a good reputation than a garage full of cars. No one is as impressed with your possessions as you are because everyone else is too busy thinking about their own lives and their own desires. By letting go of the need for external validation through consumption, you gain a level of financial independence that most people will never experience. You learn to value wealth for what it can do for your life rather than for what it can say about your status. Chapter 9, Wealth is What You Don't See. In the 9th chapter, Housel makes a clear and vital distinction between being rich and being wealthy. He explains that we often confuse the two because we tend to judge people's financial success by what we can see with our eyes. Being rich is a function of current income. It is the person who drives a $100,000 car or lives in a massive mansion because those things require a high monthly cash flow or a significant amount of debt to maintain. Being rich is visible and loud. Wealth, however, is what you do not see. Wealth is the income that is not spent. It is the assets that have not yet been converted into the things you see. It is the optionality, the flexibility, and the growth that sits in a brokerage account or a bank balance. Housel points out that our society is flooded with people who are rich but not wealthy, and people who are wealthy but do not look rich. When someone drives a luxury car, we know they are rich because they had the money to buy it or the credit to lease it. But we do not know if they are wealthy because that purchase actually decreased their wealth by the exact amount the car cost. Every dollar spent on a status symbol is a dollar that is no longer working for you through compounding. This is why it is so difficult to learn from wealthy people, because their success is hidden. It is easy to find role models for being rich because their consumption is on full display, but it is nearly impossible to find role models for being wealthy because their success is defined by restraint. The author suggests that most people actually want to be millionaires only so they can spend $1 million. But spending $1 million is literally the opposite of being a millionaire. The true value of wealth lies in its ability to provide you with a cushion against life's uncertainties. It is the money that allows you to take a sabbatical to start a new business or to stay calm during a market crash. When you spend your money on things, you are trading your future freedom for a temporary burst of dopamine. Wealth is the ability to choose, but every time you buy something to show off, you are narrowing your future choices. Housel emphasizes that staying wealthy requires a different kind of discipline than the one needed to get rich. It requires the ability to suppress the ego and to find satisfaction in things that cannot be seen by others. We are conditioned by media and advertising to believe that the point of having money is to buy things, but the most successful long-term investors understand that the point of having money is to have more money. This is not about greed, but about security. By keeping your expectations low and your savings rate high, you create a gap between your income and your lifestyle. That gap is where wealth is born and where true financial peace of mind resides. The chapter concludes by challenging the reader to redefine their version of success. If you judge yourself by the quality of your possessions, you will always be at the mercy of the next upgrade or the next trend. But if you judge yourself by the amount of control you have over your life, you will find that wealth is the most powerful tool you can own. Learning to be happy with what you have while your assets grow silently in the background is the ultimate financial superpower. It allows you to build a life that is truly rich on the inside, even if it looks ordinary on the outside. Chapter 10. Save Money. In the 10th chapter, Housel makes the bold claim that your savings rate is more important than your investment returns or your income level. He argues that building wealth has little to do with how much you earn or how well your investments perform and everything to do with your savings rate. This is because your income and investment returns are often outside of your direct control. You cannot force the stock market to give you a 10% return, and you cannot always guarantee a massive raise at work. However, you have total control over your ego and your spending habits, which are the primary drivers of your ability to save. Housel explains that wealth is simply the accumulated leftover after you spend what you take in. You can build wealth without a high income, but you have no chance of building wealth without a high savings rate. He points out that efficiency is just as important in finance as it is in energy. Just as a car that gets better gas mileage can go further on the same amount of fuel, a person with a high savings rate can achieve financial independence much faster on the same amount of income. By learning to be happy with less, you effectively increase the power of every dollar you earn. The author emphasizes that most people save for a specific goal, like a down payment on a house or a new car, while goal-oriented saving is good. Housel advocates for saving for the sake of saving. Saving without a specific end goal provides you with a hedge against life's inevitable surprises. It gives you the ability to wait for the right opportunity or the resilience to handle a sudden crisis. In a world that is increasingly volatile and unpredictable, the person with the most cash on hand has the most options. This invisible return on your savings is often more valuable than the interest rate you earn in a bank account. A major theme of this chapter is that past a certain level of income, what you need is just what sits below your ego. Most people spend money to show others that they have money. If you can suppress the urge to prove your status to the world, you will find that you have a massive surplus of capital. Savings is the difference between your ego and your income. By keeping your ego in check, you create a permanent advantage for your future self. You stop being a victim of lifestyle creep where your expenses rise to meet every pay increase, and you start building a foundation of true security. Housel concludes by stating that the ability to save is a competitive advantage in the modern economy. In a globalized world where intelligence and talent are becoming commodities, the ability to be patient and disciplined with your money is a rare and valuable trait. You do not need a reason to save. You save because it gives you control over your time and your choices. This flexibility is the ultimate currency. By prioritizing your savings rate today, you are buying a version of yourself that is free from the anxieties of financial dependence tomorrow. Chapter 11. Reasonable greater than rational. In the 11th chapter, Housel explores the idea that when it comes to managing money, being reasonable is more effective than trying to be coldly rational. He explains that academic finance is often built on the idea that people should make decisions based strictly on what the math says is most efficient. However, humans are not spreadsheets. We are emotional, social, and sometimes fearful creatures. A purely rational person would look at the data and make the optimal choice every time, but a reasonable person makes decisions that allow them to sleep at night and stay the course when things get difficult. The author uses the example of paying off a mortgage early to illustrate this point. Mathematically, it is often irrational to pay off a low-interest mortgage when you could potentially earn a higher return by investing that same money in the stock market. However, many people feel a deep sense of security and peace of mind when they own their home outright. While the math might say they are losing out on a few percentage points of gain, the emotional benefit of being debt-free is entirely reasonable. This emotional stability is what prevents them from panicking during a market crash or making impulsive decisions when their job is at risk. Housel argues that the best financial plan is the one that you can actually stick to. If a rational plan requires you to endure extreme volatility or to live like a monk, you are likely to abandon it at the worst possible moment. A reasonable plan acknowledges your human flaws and builds in room for error and comfort. It is better to have a good strategy that you can follow for 30 years than a perfect strategy that you quit after 6 months because it was too stressful. Success in investing is mostly about endurance, and being reasonable is the fuel that allows you to endure. The chapter also touches on the idea that people have a psychological need to feel in control of their destiny. This is why many investors prefer to pick their own stocks or follow a specific theme, even if index funds are statistically more likely to outperform them. While it might be irrational to think you can beat the market, it is reasonable to want to have a personal connection to where your money is going. This engagement keeps you interested and invested in the process. As long as these choices do not lead to catastrophic risk, they can be a healthy way to manage the boredom that often accompanies long-term investing. Housel emphasizes that you should not aim to be a cold, calculating machine. Instead, you should aim to be a person who is mostly logical but also aware of their own heart. You should make decisions that are smart enough to work, but also comfortable enough to live with. When the market is falling and the news is terrifying, the person who made the rational choice might be the first to sell because they only cared about the numbers. The person who made the reasonable choice is more likely to stay calm because their plan was built to survive their own emotions. The chapter concludes by suggesting that we should stop judging ourselves for making choices that do not perfectly align with the latest financial theory. If a certain habit or investment makes you feel safe and happy, it is a good choice, even if the spreadsheet says otherwise. The goal of money is to provide a better life, and a better life includes being able to sleep soundly. By choosing to be reasonable over being rational, you align your financial strategy with your human nature, which is the most sustainable way to build long-term wealth. Chapter 12. Surprise. In the 12th chapter, Housel warns against the common trap of relying too heavily on past data to predict what the future will look like. He argues that history is the study of change, which is ironic because investors often use it as a map for what to expect next. While history helps us understand how people respond to stress or greed, it cannot tell us what the next big event will be. The most important events in history are the ones that have no precedent. These are the outliers, the black swans, and the accidents that no one saw coming. When we look back at the past, we are seeing a record of things that already happened, but we often mistake those specific events for the boundaries of what is possible. The author explains that the world is constantly evolving and that the further back you look in history, the more likely you are to be looking at a world that no longer exists. For example, the way the stock market behaved in the 1950s is not a great indicator of how it will behave today, because the types of companies, the level of technology, and the number of participants have all changed fundamentally. Many financial experts rely on historical averages to project future returns, but those averages are often skewed by extreme events that may never happen again, or by conditions that are no longer relevant. Basing your entire financial strategy on the idea that the future will look exactly like the past is a form of intellectual laziness that leads to being blindsided by reality. Housel emphasizes that the most important part of any plan is to plan for the plan, not going according to plan. This means acknowledging that the biggest risk is always the one that no one is talking about. If everyone is worried about inflation, the economy might actually be hit by something completely different, like a pandemic or a technological shift. The surprises are what move the needle. You cannot prepare for a specific surprise because, by definition, you do not know what it is. However, you can prepare for the general idea that surprises will happen by keeping your debt low, staying flexible, and maintaining a high level of liquidity. The chapter discusses the idea of structural change. The economy is a living organism that adapts to new information and new challenges. When a specific strategy becomes popular, it often stops working because so many people are trying to exploit it that the advantage disappears. This is why many of the most successful investors of the past would struggle in today's market if they used the exact same tactics. The only thing that stays the same is human nature. People will always be prone to fear and greed, and they will always overreact to news. While the specific events change the way humans process those events is relatively consistent. Housel suggests that history should be used as a guide for how people behave, rather than a guide for what will happen. You should look at the past to see how people handled the Great Depression or the dot-com bubble to understand the limits of human endurance and the dangers of overconfidence. You should not look at it to try and figure out the exact date of the next recession. The goal of studying history is to gain a sense of perspective and to build a philosophy that is robust enough to handle the unknown. It is better to be roughly right and prepared for anything than to be precisely wrong and vulnerable to a single surprise. The chapter concludes by reminding us that the most important events in your life and in the global economy will be things that were never on your radar. The world is a chaotic and messy place that does not follow a neat script. By embracing the idea of surprise, you become less fragile. You stop trying to predict the future and you start focusing on building a financial life that can survive whatever the future throws at you. The ability to stay calm when the unexpected happens is more valuable than any amount of historical data. Chapter 13. Room for Error. In the 13th chapter, Housel discusses the concept of the margin of safety, which he identifies as the most underappreciated force in finance. He defines room for error as the only way to safely navigate a world that is governed by odds rather than certainties. Most people think of a financial plan as a roadmap that tells them exactly where they will be at a certain time, but Housel argues that a plan is only useful if it can survive the moments when things go wrong. If your plan requires everything to go perfectly for you to succeed, then your plan is actually a fragile gamble. The goal of building room for error is to make sure that you can stay in the game long enough to let the long-term odds of success work in your favor. The author explains that many people fail because they do not account for the gap between what they want to happen and what is likely to happen. For example, if you estimate that you need an 8% annual return to reach your retirement goals, you should actually build your plan around a 5% return. By doing this, you create a cushion that allows you to be okay even if the market underperforms. If the market does better than 5%, you simply end up with more money than you expected, which is a much better problem than the alternative. Room for error is not a lack of confidence. It is a realistic acknowledgement that the world is messy and that you are not a perfect forecaster. Housel highlights that the biggest risk is always what you cannot see or what you do not expect. He tells the story of how German tanks during the Battle of Stalingrad failed not because they were outgunned, but because field mice had eaten the insulation off the electrical wires while the tanks were parked in the grass. No general could have predicted that mice would be the cause of a military disaster, but that is exactly how risk works in the real world. In your financial life, the equivalent of those mice might be a sudden medical emergency, a lawsuit, or a total change in the industry you work in. Having a large cash reserve that seems unnecessary during good times is the only way to protect yourself against the risks that no one is talking about. A key part of this chapter is the distinction between being broke and being wiped out. Being broke is a temporary setback that you can recover from with hard work and time. Being wiped out means you are forced to exit the game entirely, such as by losing your home or being forced to sell your stocks at the bottom of a market crash. Room for error is the tool that prevents you from being wiped out. It allows you to endure the volatility and the bad luck without being forced to make permanent decisions based on temporary circumstances. Housel notes that you can be wrong about many things and still do well if you have enough room for error to survive your mistakes. The author also discusses the importance of having a gap between your ego and your income, which we touched on in previous chapters. This gap acts as a secondary form of room for error. If you live a modest life that is well below your means, you have a built-in safety net that allows you to handle a pay cut or a period of unemployment without losing your standard of living. People who live at the edge of their income have zero room for error and are therefore the most vulnerable to the smallest changes in the economy. Flexibility and the ability to pivot are the ultimate rewards of a margin of safety. Housel concludes by stating that the best way to deal with an unpredictable future is to be humble about what you know. You should expect your investments to have periods of poor performance, and you should expect your own life to have periods of struggle. By building room for error into every part of your financial life, you ensure that you are never at the mercy of a single event. You stop trying to be the smartest person in the room and start focusing on being the one who is still standing when everyone else has been forced to quit. Chapter 14. You'll Change. In the 14th chapter, Housel addresses the end of history illusion, which is the tendency for people to recognize how much they have changed in the past, while underestimating how much their personalities, desires, and goals will change in the future. This creates a significant challenge for long-term financial planning because the person making the decisions today is essentially a stranger to the person who will have to live with those decisions in 20 or 30 years. We often make permanent commitments to careers or lifestyles based on what we want at age 18 or 25, only to find that our priorities have completely shifted by the time we reach 40 or 50. The author explains that this psychological quirk makes it very difficult to pick a single path and stick to it forever. Many people enter a field for the money only to find they crave time and meaning later in life, while others start out with a passion for a specific craft, but eventually realize they need the security of a higher income. Because we are such poor predictors of our future selves, Housel suggests that we should avoid the extreme ends of financial planning. If you sacrifice everything today to save for a future you might not even want, you are likely to experience regret. Similarly, if you spend everything today and leave your future self with nothing, you are creating a different kind of misery. Housel advocates for a strategy of moderation throughout your life. By not swinging to the extremes of either total frugality or total indulgence, you increase the odds that you can stick with a plan even as your tastes change. This middle ground approach allows for a lifestyle that is enjoyable today while still building a safety net for tomorrow. It is an acknowledgement that the person you are today is just one version of yourself, and your plan needs to be flexible enough to accommodate the versions of you that have yet to appear. The goal is to minimize the potential for future regret by not locking yourself into a rigid identity or a fixed financial requirement. The chapter also discusses the concept of sunk costs and the importance of being able to pivot. Many people stay in a career or keep an investment they no longer believe in simply because they have already put so much time or money into it. Housel argues that this is a mistake. He suggests that we should treat our past decisions as the choices of a different person and give ourselves the permission to change our minds. Abandoning a plan that no longer serves you is not a failure. It is a realistic response to the fact that you have grown. The ability to move on without feeling burdened by your past self is a key component of long-term financial success. Housel emphasizes that we should accept the reality of change rather than fighting it. We should build our financial lives with the expectation that our goals will evolve. This might mean choosing a career that offers a broad set of skills rather than a highly specialized one, or maintaining a portfolio that provides liquidity so you can access your capital when your life takes a new direction. By embracing the fact that you will change, you become more adaptable and less likely to be trapped by the choices of your younger self. The chapter concludes by reminding us that the point of money is to support the life you want to live. Since that life will inevitably look different at different stages of your journey, your relationship with money must be dynamic. Success is not about picking a point on a map and never wavering, but about having the resources and the mindset to adjust your course as you discover more about who you are. Being kind to your future self means giving that person the freedom to change their mind. Chapter 15. Nothing's free. In the 15th chapter, Housel discusses the idea that everything in life has a price, but in the world of finance, many of those prices are not immediately visible. When you go to a store and see a price tag on a shirt, you can decide if the item is worth the cost and pay the price or walk away. However, when it comes to investing, the price is not a label on a screen, but rather a combination of volatility, fear, uncertainty, and regret. Most people want the rewards of high returns without having to pay the emotional price that comes with them. They try to find shortcuts or ways to avoid the market's inevitable downturns, but Housel argues that these costs are simply the fee for admission to the world of wealth building. The author explains that many people view market volatility as a fine for doing something wrong, rather than a fee for doing something right. If you get a speeding ticket, it is a fine that tells you to stop breaking the rules. But if you pay for a ticket to Disneyland, it is a fee that gives you access to the experience. High returns in the stock market are no different. To get the 7 or 10% annual average return, you have to be willing to pay the price of seeing your portfolio drop 20 or 30% every few years. If you view those drops as a fine, you will try to avoid them by timing the market, which often leads to missing out on the best days. If you view them as a fee, you accept them as the necessary cost of long-term success. Housel notes that the reason so many people fail at investing is that they are unwilling to pay the price. They want the gains, but they are not willing to endure the stomach-churning feeling of a market crash. This leads to the search for a free lunch, such as a secret strategy that promises high returns with no risk. But there is no such thing as a free lunch in finance. Every attempt to avoid the fee usually ends up costing you more in the long run, through taxes, fees, lost opportunities, or the stress of a strategy that eventually fails. Successful investing requires a level of emotional maturity to look at a declining balance and realize that it is just the price of a much larger future gain. The chapter also touches on the price of other financial goals, such as the pursuit of a prestigious career or the management of a large business. These things also come with hidden costs, such as long hours away from family, the stress of competition, and the constant pressure to perform. If you are not willing to pay that price, the achievement will eventually feel like a burden rather than a success. Understanding what you are willing to pay for is just as important as knowing what you want to buy. You have to decide if the emotional and social cost of a specific path is something you can afford in the long term. Housel emphasizes that identifying the price of a goal is the first step toward achieving it. Once you realize that volatility is a fee and not a fine, your perspective shifts. You stop being surprised or angry when the market fluctuates, and you start seeing it as a routine part of the process. This shift in mindset allows you to stay calm when others are panicking. It transforms a terrifying experience into a manageable transaction. By being willing to pay the price of uncertainty, you position yourself to collect the rewards that only come to those who have the endurance to stay the course. The chapter concludes by reminding us that the best things in life are rarely free. Whether it is a good relationship, a healthy body, or a secure financial future, there is always a cost involved. In finance, that cost is often psychological. If you can accept the emotional price of investing as a normal part of the game, you will have a massive advantage over everyone else who is looking for an easy way out. Wealth is not just about the money you have, but about your willingness to endure the price of getting there. Chapter 16. You and Me. In the 16th chapter, Housel explores the idea that many financial disagreements and mistakes happen because we fail to realize that different people are playing completely different games with their money. He argues that there is no single right way to invest because everyone has different goals, time horizons, and personal circumstances. A short-term day trader and a 30-year retirement investor are looking at the same stock prices, but they are playing different games. For the day trader, a stock price increasing for a few hours is a win, but for the long-term investor, that same price movement is completely irrelevant. The trouble begins when we start taking financial advice or cues from people who are playing a different game than we are. The author explains that many of the most famous market bubbles in history occurred because long-term investors started following the lead of short-term speculators. During the dot-com bubble or the housing boom, prices began to rise because people were buying assets with the intention of selling them a few days or weeks later. When long-term investors saw these prices rising, they mistakenly thought the market was signaling a long-term trend, and they bought in at the peak. They failed to realize that the people driving the prices up were playing a game of momentum, while they were trying to play a game of value. When the speculators left the market, the long-term investors were left holding assets they could no longer justify. Housel suggests that it is vital to identify what game you are playing and to ignore everything else. If your goal is to build wealth over 30 years, you should not care about what a hedge fund manager says about the next quarter or what a teenager on social media says about a new cryptocurrency. Their goals and their ability to handle risk are not the same as yours. When you follow someone else's lead without knowing their time horizon, you're like a marathon runner trying to keep pace with a sprinter. You might keep up for a short distance, but you will eventually burn out because you are not prepared for the duration of your own race. The chapter emphasizes that money is deeply personal, and what is rational for one person can be completely irrational for another. A young person with a high income might be perfectly rational in taking massive risks, while an older person nearing retirement would be acting irrationally by doing the same. We often judge others for their spending or investing habits without understanding the game they are playing. By focusing on your own game, you protect yourself from the volatility and the noise of the crowd. You stop comparing your progress to people who are headed toward a different destination. Housel encourages the reader to define their own game as clearly as possible. This means knowing exactly why you are saving, how much risk you are truly willing to take, and when you will need the money. Once you have a clear understanding of your own rules, it becomes much easier to filter out the endless stream of financial news and opinions. You realize that most of the information out there is for people playing a different game, and it does not apply to you. This clarity provides a level of peace and discipline that is impossible to achieve if you are constantly looking over your shoulder at what others are doing. The chapter concludes by stating that the biggest risk to your financial health is not the market or the economy, but the influence of people who have different priorities than you do. Success comes from staying true to your own strategy and refusing to be lured into a game that was not designed for your life. By mastering the game you have chosen to play, you ensure that your financial decisions are always aligned with your own version of happiness and security. Chapter 17. The Seduction of Pessimism. In the 17th chapter, Housel examines why pessimism is so much more common and persuasive than optimism, especially when it comes to money. He notes that while optimism is often viewed as a sales pitch or a sign of being naive, pessimism sounds like someone trying to help you. It feels smarter and more intellectually rigorous to predict a disaster than to suggest things will continue to improve. If you tell someone that a recession is coming, they will listen intently and perhaps even take notes. But if you tell them that the next decade will be prosperous, they're likely to roll their eyes or dismiss you as a dreamer. The author explains that money is so important to our survival that we are biologically wired to pay more attention to threats than to opportunities. A loss of money can have a devastating impact on our lifestyle and our future, so our brains prioritize any information that suggests a potential decline. This makes us vulnerable to the constant stream of negative news and doomsday predictions that fill the financial media. Pessimism also grows much faster than optimism. A market crash can happen in a few days and wipe out years of gains, while wealth is built slowly through the silent and boring process of compounding. Because destruction is fast and dramatic, it grabs our attention, while growth is slow and gradual, making it easy to overlook. Housel points out that the history of the world is a series of problems being solved by human ingenuity. Yet we constantly forget this when we look at the future. Every generation has faced challenges that seemed insurmountable at the time, from wars and pandemics to energy crises and economic depressions. In the middle of those events, pessimism feels like the only logical response. However, the long-term trend has always been one of progress, because people do not just sit still when things go wrong. They innovate, they adapt, and they find new ways to create value. Optimism is not the belief that everything will be great, but the belief that the odds of a good outcome are in your favor over time, despite the inevitable setbacks along the way. The chapter emphasizes that being a successful investor requires you to be an optimist who is aware of the risks. You have to believe in the long-term future of the economy while acknowledging that the short term will be full of surprises and pain. If you fall for the seduction of pessimism, you will be tempted to move to cash or exit the market every time a new threat appears. This behavior prevents you from capturing the gains that only come to those who stay invested. Pessimists often look right in the short term because there is always something going wrong somewhere. But optimists are the ones who end up right in the long term because the world generally trends toward improvement. Housel concludes by warning the reader to be wary of those who claim the end is near. While it is important to be prepared for downturns, living in a state of constant fear is a recipe for financial mediocrity. Realizing that pessimism is a seductive trap helps you maintain the perspective needed to let your investments grow. By understanding that progress happens too slowly to notice, but setbacks happen too quickly to ignore, you can balance your expectations and remain steady when the noise of the world becomes deafening. Chapter 18. When You'll Believe Anything. In the 18th chapter, Housel discusses the power of stories and the concept of motivated reasoning, which is the idea that we are more likely to believe a narrative if we have a strong desire for it to be true. He explains that the more you want something to be true, the more likely you are to believe a story that overestimates the odds of it happening. This is why people continue to fall for investment scams or get swept up in speculative bubbles. When we are desperate for a solution or a quick way to build wealth, our critical thinking skills often take a back seat to our emotions. We create what the author calls room for error in our beliefs because the alternative of being wrong is too painful to accept. The author notes that stories are more powerful than statistics because they are easier to understand and more emotionally resonant. A complex set of data points might tell a true story about a company or the economy, but a simple and compelling narrative about a visionary leader or a revolutionary technology is much more likely to attract investors. This creates a gap between reality and perception. We often fill this gap with our own desires and biases, which makes us vulnerable to making decisions based on fiction rather than fact. The bigger the stakes, the more we want to believe that we have control over the situation, which leads us to adopt stories that provide a sense of certainty where none exists. Housel uses historical examples to show how collective delusions can take hold of entire societies. When everyone around you is getting rich and the story of a new era is being told, it becomes socially and psychologically difficult to remain skeptical. You don't want to feel like you are missing out on the opportunity of a lifetime, so you convince yourself that the rules of finance have changed. This is a form of self-deception that allows people to ignore red flags that would be obvious in any other context. We are all prone to this because we all have things we want to be true, such as the idea that we are smarter than the average investor, or that the market will always recover just in time for our retirement. The chapter emphasizes the importance of maintaining a level of intellectual humility and being aware of your own motivations. You should ask yourself if you believe a certain piece of financial advice because it is supported by evidence or because it fits the narrative you want for your life. By recognizing that your brain is wired to seek out comfort and certainty, you can begin to question the stories you tell yourself. It is better to accept a hard truth today than to suffer the consequences of a comfortable lie tomorrow. Wealth management is as much about managing your own delusions as it is about managing your money. Housel concludes by stating that the world is too complex for anyone to have a perfect understanding of how it works. We all use stories to fill in the gaps of our knowledge, and those stories help us make sense of the chaos. However, we must be careful not to let those stories become our reality. By staying grounded in the data and being honest about what we do not know, we can protect ourselves from the seductive power of a good story. True financial wisdom comes from the ability to distinguish between what is actually happening and what we desperately wish would happen. Chapter 19. All together now. In the 19th chapter, Housel ties together the various themes of the book into a cohesive set of actionable principles. He acknowledges that while the previous chapters covered a lot of ground, the core of successful financial behavior can be distilled into a few essential mindset shifts. This chapter acts as a summary and a final reflection on how to apply the psychology of money to your own life. He emphasizes that the goal is not to be a perfect investor, but to be a consistently good one by avoiding the psychological traps that lead to ruin. The author provides a list of recommendations to help you navigate your financial journey. First, he suggests that you should find humility when things go well and forgiveness when they go wrong. This is because the world is complex and both luck and risk play a massive role in our outcomes. By acknowledging that you are never as good or as bad as your latest result suggests, you can maintain the emotional balance needed to stay the course over many decades. He also reiterates the importance of a high savings rate, noting that your wealth is simply the accumulated leftover after you spend what you take in. Housel emphasizes that you should manage your money in a way that helps you sleep at night. This is a return to the idea that being reasonable is better than being strictly rational. If a high equity portfolio causes you to panic during market volatility, it is the wrong portfolio for you, regardless of what the math says. Your primary objective should be to maximize your endurance so that you can stay in the game long enough to benefit from the power of compounding. This often means keeping more cash than seems necessary, or accepting lower returns in exchange for more stability. The chapter also highlights the value of time as the most important variable in wealth creation. Housel reminds us that the most powerful thing you can do for your portfolio is to increase your time horizon. Most of the rewards of compounding are backloaded, and the only way to reach them is to avoid interrupting the process. This requires a level of patience that is rare in a modern world obsessed with quick results. By focusing on survival and longevity, rather than chasing the highest possible returns, you allow the natural math of the market to work for you. Finally, Housel encourages the reader to be clear about the game they are playing. You must define your own goals and values rather than letting society or the media define them for you. Once you know what you are aiming for, it becomes much easier to ignore the noise and the opinions of people who have different priorities. Success is ultimately about having the freedom to live life on your own terms. By applying the lessons of the book, you are not just building a bank account, you are building a life of autonomy and peace of mind. The book ends with a deeply personal postscript where Housel shares his own financial strategy, including his preference for low-cost index funds and a paid-off house. He admits that his choices might not be the most mathematically optimal, but they are the ones that make him and his family feel the most secure. This reinforces his message that the psychology of money is personal, and that the best plan is the one that works for your unique human nature. Chapter 20. Confessions. In the final chapter, Housel moves away from general principles to share his own personal financial choices. He prefaces this by reiterating that there is no single right answer in finance, only the answer that works for you and your family. His personal strategy is built around two main goals, which are simplicity and independence. He and his wife decided early on that they wanted a life where they never felt pressured to make money they did not need, which allowed them to make decisions based on happiness rather than a higher net worth. One of the most surprising confessions Housel makes is that he and his wife own their home outright with no mortgage. From a purely mathematical standpoint, this is often considered a poor move because the interest rate on a mortgage is typically lower than the expected return of the stock market. However, he explains that the psychological benefit of knowing they own their home, no matter what happens to the economy, is worth more to them than the extra percentage points of profit. This choice provides them with an unbeatable level of independence and reduces their monthly expenses to a point where they feel incredibly secure. When it comes to investing, Housel reveals that his entire portfolio consists of low-cost Vanguard index funds and a significant amount of cash. He does not try to pick individual stocks or time the market, even though he spends his entire career studying finance. He believes that the more complex a strategy is, the more likely it is to fail when you are under stress. By keeping things simple, he ensures that he will never be tempted to tinker with his investments or change his mind when the market becomes volatile. His strategy is designed for endurance rather than maximum performance. Housel also keeps a much higher percentage of his net worth in cash than most financial advisors would recommend. He views this cash not as a missed opportunity for returns, but as an insurance policy against the unknown. It provides the room for error he discussed in earlier chapters, allowing him to avoid ever being a forced seller of his stocks during a crash. This liquidity gives him the freedom to say no to opportunities he doesn't want, and the ability to say yes to the things that truly matter to him, such as spending time with his children. The chapter emphasizes that his strategy works for him because it is aligned with his personality. He is not trying to beat the market or prove he is the smartest person in the room. He is simply trying to be financially unbreakable, so that he can enjoy his life without worrying about money. He encourages readers to be honest about their own desires and to build a plan that makes them feel safe rather than a plan that looks good on a spreadsheet. Success is ultimately personal, and your financial decisions should reflect your unique values and goals. Housel concludes the book by reminding us that the ultimate goal of money is to provide a better life. If your wealth creates more stress and anxiety than it relieves, you are doing something wrong regardless of your bank balance. By finding the balance between being reasonable and being rational, you can create a financial life that is both sustainable and fulfilling. Postscript: a brief history of why the US consumer thinks the way they do. In the postscript, Housel provides a historical deep dive into the evolution of the American economy after World War II to explain why our modern financial expectations often feel so disconnected from reality. He argues that the unique conditions of the late 1940s and 1950s created a specific cultural blueprint for what a normal life should look like. After the war, the United States was the only major industrial power left standing, with its infrastructure intact. This led to a period of unprecedented and relatively equal economic growth, where the gap between the rich and the poor was at its narrowest in history. The author explains that this era was defined by a sense of collective prosperity. During the 1950s, the median family income grew rapidly, and because there was a high degree of social cohesion, people didn't feel the need to outdo their neighbors. A factory worker and a middle manager often lived in similar houses and drove similar cars. This created a culture of expectation where people believed that if they worked hard, they would naturally see their standard of living rise every single year. This period formed the basis of the American dream, which was built on the idea of steady, predictable progress for everyone. However, things began to change in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Economic growth became more uneven, and the gap between the top earners and everyone else began to widen significantly. While the median income started to stagnate, the lifestyle of the ultra-wealthy became much more visible due to the rise of mass media and eventually the internet. This created a psychological strain where the average consumer felt the need to keep up with a standard of living that was no longer supported by their actual wages. To bridge the gap, Americans began to rely heavily on debt. Housel notes that the rise of consumer credit, including credit cards and easy mortgages, allowed people to maintain the appearance of the 1950s dream while living on a financial edge. We moved from a society that saved for what it wanted to a society that financed its desires. This shift was not because people became more greedy, but because they were trying to maintain a sense of social belonging in a world where the goalposts of success were moving further and further away. The pressure to keep up with the Joneses became an impossible race because the Joneses were now the celebrities and billionaires seen on screens. The postscript highlights that much of our modern financial frustration comes from comparing our current lives to a historical anomaly. The post-war period was a rare moment in history that is unlikely to be repeated. By understanding that our expectations were shaped by a specific set of circumstances, we can begin to let go of the guilt and the pressure to meet an unrealistic standard. Housel suggests that recognizing this history is the first step toward building a more personal and sustainable relationship with money that is not dictated by outdated cultural narratives. He concludes by observing that the story of the American consumer is a story of adaptation. We are constantly trying to figure out how to navigate a changing world with tools and mindsets that were designed for a different era. By looking back at how we got here, we can gain the perspective needed to make better choices for our own future. The goal is to move away from the expectations of the past and toward a financial life that is based on our actual needs and values in the present. Endnotes. In the endnotes of the book, Housel provides additional context and references for the studies and anecdotes he used to build his arguments. While endnotes are often seen as a place for dry citations, Housel uses them to reinforce the idea that the psychology of money is a multidisciplinary subject. He draws from history, sociology, and biology to prove that our financial behaviors are deeply rooted in our evolutionary past and our cultural upbringing. He emphasizes that the book is not meant to be a technical manual, but a guide to the human side of finance, which is often the part that matters most. One of the key points in this section is the acknowledgement of how much luck plays a role in the stories we celebrate as success. Housel notes that for every Warren Buffett or Bill Gates, there are thousands of people who made similar bets but were hit by a negative tail event that wiped them out. By including the sources for his data, he invites the reader to look deeper into the research on how our brains process risk and reward. He stresses that while the math of finance is universal, the way we feel about that math is entirely individual. The endnotes also serve as a final reminder that the field of finance is constantly evolving. What worked in the past may not work in the future, but human nature remains the constant. Housel encourages the reader to continue exploring these topics beyond the pages of his book. He suggests that the more we understand about why we make the choices we do, the better equipped we are to handle the uncertainty of the future. The endnotes are a bridge between the narrative of the book and the vast body of research that supports his conclusions. I have now summarized the entire book, including the postscript and the closing notes. Since you are looking at these chapters in 2026, it is a great time to reflect on how these timeless principles have held up during the recent market shifts.